They didn't forget to include me. They just remembered to exclude me. I wasn't in any of the photos. Not one. They printed them all, strung them along a little ribbon above the table, smiling faces, frosted cake, paper crowns, a toddler laughing so hard his whole body tilted backward, but not me. I was there. I baked a cake. I wrapped the gift with my own hands. I stood behind the bushes when they sang happy birthday and smiled as if I belonged. But when I looked up and saw the string of photos, snapshots of joy carefully curated like memories in a shop window, I realized I had been edited out, on purpose or by accident. I didn't know. I just knew it hurt. The kind of hurt that doesn't scream. The kind that sits in your throat like a pebble too big to swallow. Rachel didn't see me at first. She was busy making sure her husband's mother had the best seat under the canopy right next to the guest of honor. The little boy in blue with frosting on his cheeks, my grandson. I stood near the garden wall, holding a plate I hadn't touched. My feet ached, but I didn't sit. The only empty chairs were in the sun. I'm used to the sun. I've been standing in it alone for a long time. It wasn't until Eli came over that the moment crystallized into something I couldn't ignore. He smiled tight, polite, performative. "You've been on your feet a while," he said, nodding toward the gate. "If you want to head out early, no one will mind. It's been a long day." I blinked, just once. Then I nodded, as if I agreed, as if it was my idea. I handed him the untouched plate and walked through the gate without saying goodbye. No one called after me. No one asked if I had somewhere to go. Rachel didn't even turn her head. I didn't cry until I reached the sidewalk. And even then, it wasn't tears I recognized, it was salt and silence, and the way my hands trembled when I reached for my keys. I sat in the car for a long time, watching families carry balloons back into SUVs. I thought about going back, just to say something, anything, but I didn't. I drove home with the radio off and the windows down, hoping the wind would sweep the ache from my bones. They thought I left quietly, that I accepted my place on the margins, in the shadow of polite exclusion. But what they didn't know is that I took something with me. Not a gift, not a grudge, something far quieter, something they didn't see coming. And it started that day when I disappeared from their photos, but decided to reappear in my own life. I wasn't kicked out of the party. I just was never invited in. When Rachel was 5, she used to draw our faces on yellow paper circles and tape them to the refrigerator like they were family medals, hers, mine, and David's, each with a crooked smile and stick arms reaching out to touch. She always gave me the biggest son in the middle, even though David was the one who built her wooden dollhouse and made her pancakes on Sundays. After he passed, I became all the sons in her world, but I never said it aloud. I just started doing things he would have done, without making a fuss, hanging shelves, fixing leaks, staying up late cross-stitching names on her camp towels while my legs ached from cleaning the 4th house of the day. I taught high school English full-time, graded papers on the bus home, then headed straight to clean vacation homes until I couldn't feel my wrists. There were nights when I fell asleep sitting up, a red pen still in my hand, Rachel's science project unfinished beside me, and in the morning I would wake up panicked that I had let her down. But she never said anything. She just slipped her hand into mine on the walk to school and told me I made the best egg sandwiches in the universe. I lived for those moments, the little affirmations, the handwritten notes she'd leave on my nightstand to the world's strongest woman. "Love, your son." I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed, with the photo of David holding her in the hospital, the day she was born. I remember her 8th grade graduation. She wore a blue dress that we picked out together from a second-hand store, and she twirled in the living room like she owned the world. I remember staying up till midnight hemming it just right because she said it scratched her knees. That night she gave me a hug so tight I couldn't breathe for a moment and whispered, "Someday I'll make you proud." And I smiled, not knowing she already had. Through college, she called every Sunday. We didn't talk long, but she always asked about my feet, my back, whether I was eating properly. Then Eli appeared, first as a name, then a voice on speaker, then a man sitting awkwardly on my floral couch, who shook my hand too firmly and smiled too hard. He had plans, big ones, and he spoke of them with the confidence of someone who thought quiet people were weak. Rachel sparkled around him, like someone under stage lights. I told myself I was imagining it, that she wasn't becoming smaller in his shadow, just learning to adapt. But I noticed how her calls shifted. Less about her days, more about logistics. Less laughter, more calendars. One Christmas, she brought store-bought pie. I didn't say anything, but she noticed. She said, "You're not mad, are you?" I told her no. But later that night, I opened the freezer and saw my unbaked apple pie still sitting there, untouched, and something in me sagged. I didn't cry. I just stared at it for a long time, like it was a letter I forgot to send. And slowly, those little shifts multiplied. She stopped asking how I was sleeping. She forgot my birthday and apologized 3 days later with a forwarded e-gift card. I told her it was fine. I always told her it was fine. I never asked for more. But the truth is, I didn't need her to shower me in affection. I just needed her to remember who I had been, who I still was. The woman who once walked miles in a snowstorm to deliver her a handmade costume because she had forgotten it at home. The woman who skipped meals so Rachel could buy a sketchbook she loved. I didn't want gratitude. I just wanted her to look at me and see the history in my hands, the stories folded into my wrinkles. But somewhere between then and now, I became a background character in a story I had helped build. And she stopped looking. I wasn't erased from her life. I just faded into the parts she didn't bother reading anymore. The first time I visited their new house, Rachel greeted me at the door with one arm still inside a grocery bag, a rushed kiss on the cheek, and a distracted smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. And I told myself it was the stress of moving, of settling in, of being a wife in a world where women were expected to balance everything without looking like they were trying. But something about the way she said "we" instead of "I" when talking about the house plans made me feel like I was hearing a version of her that had been edited, softened, filtered through someone else's expectations. And when she showed me the kitchen, the crown jewel, she called it. I nodded and complimented the tile, though I could still see the faint outline of glue where one was slightly misaligned. The kind of imperfection Rachel would have noticed once, but now seemed to overlook, as if surface polish had become more important than substance. And when Eli came downstairs, he shook my hand too firmly, smiled too broadly, asked if I'd like tea, then forgot to make it. And Rachel didn't remind him, just poured a glass of water and handed it to me like she was tending to a mild inconvenience, not her mother. And when I glanced toward the guest room, Rachel hesitated before saying, "Actually, we were thinking it might be better if you used the pull-out in the study. Eli's mom is visiting next week and we already set the linens." And I nodded because I always nodded. Even when I wanted to ask if there was a time limit on being a mother, if at some point I had become something that could be rescheduled to make room for someone more convenient. And that night, lying on a too-thin mattress beside Eli's rows of business books and framed awards, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how a daughter's love could become something so politely distant, like a service she outsourced when the emotional labor felt too heavy. And over the next few visits, I noticed more. Rachel no longer asked how I'd been sleeping or whether I still crocheted on the porch. She forgot which teas I liked and stopped making mine altogether, offering coffee instead, always black. always strong, as though she'd forgotten that I preferred warmth over bitterness. And I watched how she lit up around Eli's mother, how their conversations flowed easily, full of private jokes and shared recommendations. And I tried not to feel jealous. I tried to tell myself that love could multiply, not replace, but it's hard not to notice when your place at the table is no longer set. When your voice only fills the room during pauses and never prompts them. And once, I brought a framed photo of Rachel's graduation to leave in the hallway, a gesture, a breadcrumb of the bond we once had, but by the next visit, it was gone. And when I asked, Rachel said Eli had moved it to make space for a more neutral aesthetic. And I nodded again, always nodding. And I swallowed the question that rose in my throat like static. When did I become too personal for my own daughter's hallway? Too emotional for her kitchen? Too much of a reminder of a version of herself she no longer wanted to revisit? And the final visit before it all unraveled was when I brought homemade muffins, the same kind Rachel used to beg for before school, the ones with orange zest and cinnamon, and I left them on the counter in a container she never opened. And days later, when I asked if she liked them, she blinked, surprised, and said she'd forgotten they were from me. Eli thought they were from a neighbor and tossed them because he didn't like old-fashioned stuff. And that night I sat in my car outside their house for 20 minutes, keys in the ignition, hands in my lap, watching the warm glow of their living room spill onto the sidewalk while inside, my daughter laughed at a show I used to watch with her, curled beside a man who never saw me. And I realized then that I hadn't been excluded in one moment, but slowly, steadily, erased in increments so small they could be mistaken for oversight. And that the worst kind of loss isn't the one you see coming, it's the one that disappears in pieces until all you're left holding are the outlines of where love used to live. I wasn't forgotten. I was replaced quietly, politely, one visit at a time. It was the kind of morning that pretends to be kind, sky clear, balloons bobbing lazily on the front porch, a plastic banner that read, "Happy 5th, Jacob," in bold, cheerful letters fluttering above the gate, and I remember standing there for a moment before ringing the bell, holding a homemade gift bag in one hand and a container of the cupcakes Rachel used to beg for every birthday in the other. My breath catching in my throat, not from the walk up the hill, but from the quiet hope that maybe today, just maybe, I'd feel like part of something again. And when the door opened, it wasn't Rachel who greeted me. It was Eli, wearing a party hat slightly askew, holding a phone in one hand and waving me in with the other. "Oh, great. You're here," he said. Already halfway turned before I'd even stepped inside, and I told myself not to be disappointed, that she was probably busy in the kitchen or with Jacob. And for a while, I wandered through the decorated living room like a stranger in a space I once memorized, tracing my eyes along walls that now held nothing of me, no photos of Rachel's childhood, no trace of the home we'd once shared, just soft gray tones and magazine-perfected minimalism. And when I finally saw her, she was adjusting the cake on the dessert table, a 3-tiered fondant monument with figurines I didn't recognize, and I hesitated because it wasn't the cake I made, the one I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. icing, the one with the handmade sugar stars and the chocolate Rachel always said tastes like childhood. And when she looked up and smiled, it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach very far, more like a signal than a welcome. "Oh, Mom, you made it," she said, and she air-kissed my cheek before moving on to greet another guest. And I stood there, still holding the cupcakes, until a woman I didn't know offered to take them and placed them next to the drinks, far from the dessert table, far from the center. And I laughed under my breath because even food has a seating chart now, apparently. And I tried to be useful. I picked up napkins, straightened chairs, even offered to help with the kids' station. But someone else was already doing that, a friend of Rachel's who smiled tightly and said, "We've got it covered." And suddenly I felt like someone's outdated family heirloom, kept out of guilt, not usefulness, and I found a spot near the back patio, half shaded, half forgotten, where I could still see Jacob run and hear Rachel laugh. And I stayed there for most of the afternoon, smiling when smiled at, clapping when others clapped, waiting for someone to invite me into the real part of the event. And when the photographer came to gather people for group photos, I watched them organize into neat rows, Rachel and Eli in the center, Jacob in front, Mrs. Jennings beside him, arms around his tiny shoulders, and I waited for my name to be called, waited for a glance, a gesture, anything, but it didn't come. And when I stepped forward, just a little, the photographer smiled politely and said, "Let's get one with just the immediate family first." I gave everything, every lunchbox, every midnight fever, every birthday candle, and now I'm just convenient to forget disposable when the lighting has to be perfect. And I don't know what stung more, the word first or the silence that followed, because no one said, "Wait, what about my mom?" Not even Rachel. And I stepped back like I'd misread the room, like I'd wandered into a story that didn't belong to me anymore. And I laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that tastes like something sour, and went to sit near the garden wall, hidden but present, close enough to still witness but far enough that no one had to accommodate me. And when the candles were lit and the song was sung, I watched Jacob blow out the flames while his parents beamed and guests clapped. And I imagined myself walking up, handing him my card, whispering a wish of my own, but I stayed seated, fingers digging into the handle of my purse. And after the applause faded and plates were passed out, I walked inside to get a glass of water, hoping the cool air would ease the burning behind my eyes. And that's when Eli found me in the hallway, hand on his hip, his voice low but not soft. "Hey, Tessa," he said, using my name like punctuation. "Just a heads up, things are a little tight today. Guest-wise, space-wise, you know." And I tilted my head, not understanding at first, and then he added, "If you're feeling tired, no one would be offended if you called it an early day." And I stood there blinking, the words not quite fitting into my brain the way they were supposed to, like puzzle pieces from a different box. And he smiled like he'd done me a kindness, like suggesting I remove myself from my own grandson's party was a gentle favor. And behind him I saw Rachel, frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching, but not stepping forward, not interrupting, not saying, "Stop." And in that moment, everything settled like dust in a forgotten room. And I nodded, because what else was there to do? And I walked to the coat rack, picked up my things, and past the dessert table where my cupcakes still sat untouched. Then out the front door. No one calling after me, no footsteps following. Just the creak of the gate and the soft thud of my shoes on the concrete. And I sat in the car for a long time before turning the key, because the engine might start on demand. But my body needed time to believe what had just happened. Needed time to absorb the realization that I had become the person it was easiest to exclude. That I was now the guest who could be politely removed when the space got crowded. And I drove home in silence. The only sound, the occasional rattle of the container on the passenger seat, 12 untouched cupcakes, perfectly frosted, meant to be eaten by people who never intended to taste them. And when I got home, I placed them on my kitchen counter, took one bite, and threw the rest away because sweetness given to the wrong mouths turns bitter fast. And I sat in the dark, clutching the birthday card I never gave, listening to the house breathe around me like a witness. And I thought not about what they'd done, but about how little it took for them to do it, how easily love turns into convenience, and a mother becomes a placeholder, and dignity gets traded for a slice of cake no one asked for. I wasn't told to leave. I was just made so small it became easier if I disappeared. The days that followed felt like walking underwater, each step slow and muted, each breath thick with questions I couldn't shape into words. And I didn't tell anyone what had happened at the party, not the neighbors who still waved politely, not the woman at the post office who always asked how Rachel was doing, not even myself in the mirror, because saying it aloud would make it real, would make it permanent. And I wasn't ready to accept that my place in my daughter's life had become conditional, negotiated, trimmed around edges I hadn't even known were being cut. So instead, I folded into silence the way some people fold into prayer, deliberate, quiet, invisible, and I kept going, one small task at a time. Washing the mug she used to drink cocoa from when she was little, refolding the sweater she never came to pick up last winter, watering the plant she once gave me for Mother's Day that had long since withered, but I couldn't bring myself to throw away. And every evening I'd sit in the same spot on the couch, phone beside me, screen unlit, convincing myself I didn't care that no one was calling, that no one was asking how I was, or if I'd gotten home safely, or if I still remembered the way Jacob said Nana when he was 2. And there were moments sharp, sudden moments when I'd reach for my phone to text Rachel, just a simple thinking of you. Or did Jacob like the presents? But my fingers would freeze over the keyboard, paralyzed by the image of her reading it, blinking once, then sliding it into the pile of things she didn't know how to respond to anymore. Is this what love becomes? A burden too awkward to acknowledge? A mother's presence trimmed like an overgrown hedge, neat, silent, and safely in the background. And so I didn't text. I didn't call. I didn't knock on any door but my own. And instead, I returned to the habits of a life I thought I'd grown past, reading old cookbooks with cracked spines, dusting picture frames without glass, listening to the kettle whistle like a clock that knew when the loneliness reached boiling point. And some nights, I'd turn on the porch light and sit out front with a cup of tea just in case someone might drive by and wave, might stop, might remember, and when no one did, I told myself the stars were enough company, though even they seemed more distant lately. And I started measuring days not by meals or appointments, but by small markers of stillness, the corner of the curtain I stopped pulling back, the chair I stopped sitting in, the mailbox I checked too early and too often. And I started dreaming again, not of beautiful things, but of Rachel as a child standing in our old kitchen with peanut butter on her chin, asking if I'd still love her when she was grown and lived far away. And I would always answer yes, of course, and wake up with my heart heavy in my chest, like a promise I could no longer keep. And the ache wasn't loud. It was steady like wind against an old door, and I carried it into every room, every task, until even kindness became exhausting, until even smiling at strangers felt like lifting stones. And I didn't cry, not at first, not in the dramatic way movies teach us, but sometimes, while folding laundry or pouring milk into tea, I'd feel a tightness build behind my eyes, and I'd blink slowly, letting it settle back down, like tears trained to behave. And the worst part wasn't the pain itself, it was the shame that came with it. The quiet voice that whispered, "You let this happen. You gave too much. You stayed too long." And I started believing it, started editing myself down in conversation, stopping short of saying Rachel's name like it might reveal too much, might invite too many questions I wasn't ready to answer. And once, when an old friend asked if I'd seen my family recently, I smiled and said, "Not in a while," and quickly changed the subject. And later that night, I sat in bed holding a birthday card I'd bought months ago, the one I never gave Rachel, still blank, still waiting. And I wondered how long it would sit there before I accepted that not every gesture deserves an ending, that some love stories fade without a goodbye. And one rainy afternoon, while cleaning out the hallway closet, I found a shoebox of old crafts, Jacob's first scribbles, Rachel's macaroni necklace, a popsicle stick photo frame with our faces glued in dusty, fragile, yellowed with time. And I sat on the floor with them spread around me like evidence, like proof that I had once mattered so much it had been worth gluing, coloring, crafting. And I laughed through my tears at the irony, that these pieces remembered me better than the people who made them. And for the first time, I let the tears come not out of anger, not even out of heartbreak, but out of sheer exhaustion from pretending I was okay with being discarded so politely. And afterward, I cleaned my face, stood up, and made tea not as a ritual this time, but as an anchor, something solid in a world that had grown too soft and slippery to hold on to. I wasn't left behind. I was gently, quietly, replaced by silence. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those dull, bone-deep quiet days when the house feels more like a museum than a home, where everything is still, but none of it feels peaceful, and I had wandered into the library, not with intention, but with inertia, because I couldn't bear to sit one more hour in my kitchen watching the afternoon light crawl across the same floor where Rachel used to dance in socks too big for her feet. And the library smelled like ink and old paper, like something alive and forgotten. And I let myself drift through the aisles like someone looking for a memory she couldn't name, brushing my fingers across the spines, not expecting to stop until they did on a small cloth-bound book squeezed between two oversized volumes, crooked like it didn't belong. And when I pulled it out, the title was unfamiliar, but the texture of it in my hands felt like something I had once owned, something borrowed or once gifted and never returned. And when I opened it, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground, cream-colored and aged around the edges, and before I even picked it up, I knew it was hers, because Rachel's handwriting had always leaned to the right and curled slightly at the tail ends. And when I unfolded it, I read the first line, "To Mom, in case you ever forget how much I love you." And I sat down right there on the carpet between the fiction and poetry sections, not caring who might see, heart pounding with a kind of ache that was older than the words. And I read it all, how she wrote about the time I stayed up all night to help her build a 𝗕𝗃𝗵𝗴 volcano, how I gave her the last pancake every Saturday, even when she knew I was still hungry, how I braided her hair before school and always kissed the back of her neck because she said it made her feel brave, and how I used to hum lullabies until she fell asleep and then stayed in the room 10 more minutes just in case she needed to check if I was still there. And she ended the letter by saying she didn't always know how to say thank you, but she never stopped feeling it, not even on the hard days, not even when we argued, not even when she got older and forgot how to be soft. And I held that letter like it was breath, like it was sunlight in winter, and I felt every word seep into the cracks of the woman I'd become, the silent version, the shadowed one, the mother who now packed up her love in quiet boxes and waited for permission to give it. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I remembered what it felt like to be seen, not just noticed, but known. How ironic that a letter buried in a library knows me better than the daughter I raised. When did being quiet become being irrelevant? And it wasn't the letter itself that undid me, it was the echo of who Rachel used to be, the proof that once she had loved me loudly, freely, without hesitation. And I wondered when exactly that version of her went quiet, if it happened all at once or gradually, like warmth fading from water until you no longer notice the chill. And I sat there far longer than I should have, surrounded by books I didn't open and pages I didn't turn, clutching that fragile sheet of her younger voice and thinking about all the ways we bury tenderness beneath performance and pride. How we outgrow the very hands that built us, and how sometimes the only way to come back to love is to stumble across the version of ourselves that still remembers how to feel it. And when I finally stood up and tucked the letter into my coat, I felt something in me stir, not joy, not clarity, but a flicker of something I thought I'd lost forever, the right to hope again. And I walked home through the late autumn air, crisp and dry, the kind of weather that reminds you how alive your skin still is. And when I got to my front door, I didn't go inside right away. I just stood there, holding the letter close to my chest, and whispered thank you, not to Rachel, not to God, just to the universe for letting me find the version of her that hadn't forgotten me yet. I wasn't lost to her. I was just buried beneath the version she forgot to remember. I didn't tell anyone about the letter, didn't frame it, didn't tuck it into a drawer marked precious. I folded it slowly, carefully, like something sacred and half alive, and slid it between 2 pages of a book I kept on the nightstand, not for hiding, but for holding. And that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea gone cold and stared at the chair across from me, the one Rachel used to curl into with her knees tucked and 100 questions spilling from her mouth, and I thought about all the ways silence grows. First in small decisions, in the unspoken, in the look you pretend not to notice, in the missed call you tell yourself wasn't personal, and then suddenly, it's everywhere, like ivy wrapping around the pillars of a home you once felt safe in. And I realized then that waiting for her to remember me, to reach for me, was just another way of keeping myself in a hallway with no door. So the next morning, I got up before the sun, dressed in clothes I hadn't touched in months, and walked downtown to the old community center, the one where I used to volunteer before the pandemic, before Rachel's life grew too full to make space for mine, and I asked if they still needed help. Not with big things, just little ones. And they said yes, that the Tuesday afternoon craft class for older women was understaffed, and just like that, I said I'd be there. And I started showing up every week, teaching them how to stitch quiet things, tea cozies, bookmarks, lavender sachets, and I found myself laughing again, soft at first, like I was remembering the sound. And on one of those afternoons, I reached into the old sewing kit Rachel had once given me, a little tin box covered in sunflowers, and tucked inside was a silk handkerchief, yellow with a tiny embroidered M in the corner, something she'd made in 8th grade and wrapped with a note that said, "For when you cry happy tears." And I stared at it for a long time, not crying, just breathing. And later that week, I ironed it, folded it neatly, and placed it inside a small padded envelope along with something else, a copy of the letter I'd found in the library, scanned and printed in full, not with bitterness, not with accusation, but with quiet intention. And I wrote a short note that said, "I found this. I remember her. I miss her." "Do you and I didn't sign it, Mom?" I just wrote my name, as if I were reintroducing myself to a daughter who had long since stopped seeing me clearly. And I mailed it without ceremony. No expectation, no return request, no tracking number, just let it go like a bird you hope finds its way back. And that evening, I sat in the same chair with the same tea, but it tasted different, not because the tea had changed, but because I had. Because I had finally done something not to be seen, but to stop disappearing. And the next day, I bought paint for the living room, moved the armchair to the window, replaced the dusty rug, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel myself taking up space again, even if only in my own home. And when the Sunday market returned in spring, I set up a small booth not to sell, just to give away handmade bookmarks and embroidered words to anyone who stopped long enough to care, and people smiled, and I smiled back. And someone asked where I learned to stitch so neatly, and I said, from raising a daughter who loved to create things before she learned to hide them, and they nodded like they understood. And I didn't cry, not then, not even later, but that night. I opened the box of Rachel's childhood drawings and took out one of the sun face cutouts she used to make, the one with my name scrawled inside the rays. And I pinned it above my desk, not to remember what I lost, but to remind myself what I had once meant, and what I could still be, quietly, without permission. I didn't ask to be let back in. I just stopped standing outside the door. It was nearly 3 weeks after I mailed the letter when the doorbell rang, not a buzz or a knock, but the soft, tentative chime of someone unsure if they still belonged, and when I opened the door, Rachel stood there holding the envelope in both hands like something fragile she didn't trust herself with. Her shoulders hunched in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager standing outside the principal's office. And I said nothing, just stepped aside, letting her walk in because if she had come all this way, I needed her to cross that threshold on her own terms. And she moved like someone re-entering a dream, eyes flicking to the corners of the room, to the framed photos on the mantel, the one of her as a child holding a sparkler, the one of me in the garden David built before the diagnosis, and she sat at the kitchen table like she used to, but not quite like the ghost of the girl I raised had come to sit in her place. And for a moment, neither of us said a word, just existed in the quiet that used to hold our whole world until she cleared her throat and placed the envelope gently on the table between us and whispered, "I forgot who I was when I wrote this," and I wanted to reach out, to grab her hand, to tell her I never forgot, but I didn't, because some wounds have to bleed before they close. And she went on, her voice careful, deliberate like she was building a bridge plank by plank and hoping I wouldn't walk away before it was finished. And she said she had found the locket last week buried beneath a pile of Jacob's plastic dinosaurs, how he must have picked it up from an old keepsake box without knowing what it was, and when she opened it, she saw the photo of us. Me in a garden dress, laughing mid-bite, her with frosting on her chin, and she said it hit her like a wave, not nostalgia but guilt, because she realized that somewhere along the way she had traded something warm and alive for something polished and cold, and she cried, not for the lost time, but for how easy it had been to lose. And then she told me something I hadn't expected to hear, not from her. Not ever, she said that Eli had told her it was him or me, not with cruelty, but with the casual entitlement of someone who had never known the cost of choosing against blood. And when I asked her what she said in return, she looked up with eyes red and raw and said, "I told him I'm done letting someone else edit the story of who I get to love," and I felt something shift inside me, like a window cracking open after too many seasons shut tight. And she reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in tissue, a drawing, crumpled and soft at the edges, of a small yellow house with a swing out front and two stick figures holding hands underneath the word home, and I recognized it instantly, because she had drawn it when she was 6 and called it our forever place. And she said she'd found it taped to the back of an old sketch pad she hadn't opened in years. And I looked at it and then at her and thought of every day she hadn't come, every message she hadn't sent, every moment I'd sat in this house wondering if she still remembered what my voice sounded like when I sang her lullaby. And I realized that she did, that maybe she had buried it, maybe even abandoned it, but she had not erased it. And in that moment, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just tired of carrying it alone. And I said, "Do you want to come inside for tea?" And she nodded. And we moved slowly, cautiously, into the kitchen, where I poured chamomile into 2 mugs, hers with the small chip she always used to avoid, and we sat and sipped and let the silence between us stretch and soften. And before she left, she placed her hand over mine and said, "I don't know how to fix it." And I replied, "It's not about fixing." And she looked at me confused, and I added, "It's about remembering why it mattered in the first place." And she nodded again. And I didn't walk her to the door, didn't say goodbye, because some goodbyes are meant to be replaced with beginnings. And that night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the drawing she left behind and realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the one who had been waiting. I was the one she needed to find her way back to. She didn't choose someone else over me. She just forgot I was the place she came from. She didn't come the next day, or the day after that, and I didn't expect her to, because the kind of return that matters never rushes, never crashes through the door demanding to be welcomed. It arrives quietly, like spring after a brutal winter, like a letter without a stamp that somehow still finds its way home. And so I waited, not with desperation this time, not with a phone in my hand or a chair pulled back just in case, but with the slow patience of someone who has already made peace with silence and is learning to make room for whatever sound might come next. And in that waiting, Something shifted inside me, not a dramatic change, not a moment of epiphany, just a soft loosening of the knots I had tied around my own worth. And I found myself doing things I hadn't done in months, not for anyone else, but for the woman I had quietly become while grieving the girl I used to be, like rearranging the spice rack, repainting the porch railing, folding the laundry while humming instead of counting the minutes between each reminder of her absence. And I began walking to the park again, passing the bench where David used to read the newspaper while Rachel fed breadcrumbs to birds, and I didn't sit there out of nostalgia, but because my legs still worked, because the sun still warmed my skin, because healing is not a return to who we were, but a claiming of who we've quietly become. And then, nearly 3 weeks after she stood in my doorway like a ghost from a half-remembered dream, she came back not with tears this time, not with trembling hands or desperate apologies, but with a grocery bag full of fruit and a nervous, hopeful smile, saying, I didn't want to show up empty-handed, and I didn't say it aloud, but in my chest, something answered, You didn't. And she stepped into the house like someone re-entering a world she thought she had outgrown, moving slowly, looking around as though mapping a memory, her fingers trailing the edge of the counter like she was trying to touch something long lost. And we cooked dinner together, simple food, familiar food, her peeling carrots while I stirred the pot, and our movements found an old rhythm, not perfect, not seamless, but honest. And when we sat down to eat, she reached for the salt before I asked, passed the bread without prompting, and told me about her job, about Jacob's newfound fear of ceiling fans, about how she sometimes still hears my voice when she can't sleep, telling her to breathe through it. Sweetheart and I smiled, not just because I remembered saying it, but because she remembered hearing it. And after dinner, we did the dishes together, standing shoulder to shoulder like we once did the night before her college move-in. And I noticed she still rolled her sleeves the same way, still hummed without realizing, and at one point, she said, I've been trying to write a letter to myself about the kind of mother I want to be. And I said, start with what you needed most. And she looked at me then, really looked, and nodded. And for the first time in so long, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't guarded or distant. It was trust, fragile but whole. And in the days that followed, she returned again and again, sometimes with Jacob, sometimes alone, never with grand declarations but always with presence. And presence, I've learned, is the most precious apology. And one Saturday, she brought me a small painting, just a quiet watercolor of a house with open windows and a garden blooming in colors that didn't match, but somehow worked, and written in her soft script at the bottom were the words, the place that remembered me before I remembered myself. And I stood there holding it, tears tracing the same path down my cheeks they used to when she first said mama. And that night, after she left, I placed the painting on the wall above the fireplace, not as a trophy, not as proof, but as a symbol that healing isn't a loud return, it's a quiet staying, again and again, until one day you look around and realize the person who once walked away has begun watering the garden again. And though the roses may take time, the soil has already softened. She didn't need to explain why she left. She just needed to keep coming back until her silence turned into presence. The house is still quiet, but not in the same way. It's the kind of quiet that comes after a song, when the last note has faded, but still lingers in your chest. And tonight, as I sit by the window with a cup of tea nestled in both hands, I watch the porch light spill across the walkway Rachel once learned to ride her bike on back when she needed me to steady the back wheel and whisper, "You've got this," over and over again until she believed it herself. And now, after all these years, after the silence, the space, the aching pause between mother and daughter, I find myself whispering those same words, but this time, to me. Because I made it through the part no one talks about, the part where love gets quiet, where presence gets replaced by performance, where the people you once built your world around forget to leave you a seat at the table, and you sit alone wondering if you imagined the bond, if you dreamed the memories. And yet, here I am, still standing, still loving, still opening the door every time she knocks, not because I'm weak, not because I'm waiting, but because somewhere in the quiet I remembered who I am. And I remembered that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the pain, it's about refusing to let it harden the parts of you that still want to be soft. And as I tuck Jacob's latest drawing into the corner of the fridge, crooked and bright, I smile. Not because everything is perfect, but because we are all still here, trying, showing up with trembling hands and borrowed courage. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what family really means, not always getting it right, but always leaving the light on just in case someone decides to come home. If you've ever stood quietly in the background of a life you helped build, if you've ever felt like love forgot to save you a chair, remember that you are not invisible. You are the thread that holds everything together. Try writing yourself back into your own story, even if the first page trembles, because no one can take away the worth of someone who never stopped loving, even when no one was looking.